Hi. So I've probably titled this video, "Is the reptile community toxic?" from the perspective of a toxic person, right? It might be a little bit confusing, but follow along with me for just a moment. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of tea, probably a few jokes, and we'll make fun of reptiles and research while we're here. Why not, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is I've promised to do a video on the lavender albino genetic testing that I did with equipment from Mini PCR. Since that kind of interleaves into this topic, here's a little bit of a story of how that's going. So I've been able to recreate the experiment several times, and each time the results have produced exactly what was expected. So in my specific case, I have a visual lavender albino, a het lavender albino, the offspring of those, and and of course anything that's a wild type, right? So between those 4 different results, I have been able to just repeatedly do that test and get the exact same results. So that's working exactly as expected. Pretty proud of myself, right? So comp sci major, and I'm mucking around in biology stuff, and yeah, so really excited about that. However, the thing that kind of takes the fun out of it is that I've been contacted by probably no less than 20 people, right? So you would think, oh, people are interested in genetic testing, right? Well, you'd be wrong about that one. So somebody that didn't contact me directly but ended up talking to on Facebook actually started to say that breeders that were already using Rare Genetics Incorporated's test for genetics were no better than Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos, which is just completely ridiculous, right? So that's of course a pop culture recent news kind of mention, or however you can go look up Theranos if you don't know the story. Basically, all the tests were fraud. There's a ton of fraud going on. A bunch of people are in bad places, right? So comparing something like the gene testing that people have been working on for the last few years to something like that is just completely insane, completely insane. It's obviously something they heard on Joe Rogan or something and ran with it. It just didn't make any sense, right? So the people that directly contacted me, so I had a few tell me that I'm ruining the entire ball python industry, which I, again, did not originate these tests. I did not originate the study of genetics. I simply put together some of the equipment that was available to do this on my own. If anything, all credit goes to, of course, tons of researchers that came before me, and specifically Dr. Hannah Seidel and her students at Eastern Michigan University, who have put in a lot of work on getting these genes isolated. So really, it kind of takes the fun out of the whole thing when you have, the majority of those 20 people have not had positive things to say. I've had a handful of people tell me that I'm not special because they do that in their classroom every day. Great. If you are a teacher that are doing these tests in your classroom for ball pythons, make a video. No one has made a video yet. Everybody, of course, has said they've already been doing this and they've been doing it for years and all this other stuff in the typical, reptile hobby fashion, and there's no videos. So I gave you the opportunity. The next thing is to actually make my own video, I guess, right? So all of the people that are calling me unqualified and all this other stuff, it's good to know that you're not qualified enough to record it. So that's really annoying. It's really frustrating. Now, to be fair, I've probably had maybe 5 people that were really interested in the test. For a few people, it has been a little bit cost prohibitive because it was expensive to collect all of that equipment. I want to say that the bill was at least $2,000, but you can shave off quite a few things, and we'll talk about that in a future video. So probably 2 people have actually started doing the tests on their own, just like I did. They went through all the same steps. In some places, they have source things from different areas. And that's really interesting. That's the part of other communities that I really feel like the reptile community lacks. There's a concept that's called let's learn together, right? So when people make YouTube videos and they're talking about these concepts, and you'll especially see this over on the technology side, right? So people will learn a concept and then they'll present it and they'll let you know, I want to learn together, right? And that's where other people will come and share their experiences, and you're able to come up with something that is, maybe negotiate between what you two are doing to be successful and come out with a middle ground, or, pick up tips from each other, or however you want to say it. If you've been a member of the reptile community for more than a day, then you know that the reptile community is full of many people that only believe in a binary my way and the wrong way, right? And so that goes across the board, right? A really great false dichotomy that people like to make is the idea of the ethical keeper community and the morph market community or world of ball pythons or whatever you want to stick in there, right? So of course the implication is one is ethical, then the other one must not be ethical, right? And that's already tacky. And the word ethical, as we've heard before from places like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, it really comes into question what ethical actually means. It's a very tacky word to use to begin with, and I'm really surprised that so many people have donned that kind of, crusader cloak or whatever you want to call it, to call themselves ethical keepers. But it really doesn't matter which side it is. If you float over into what would be the ethical keepers, then you've just got a bunch of people that don't own any animals that are dictating what they read on some, I don't know, Reptifiles or something, which is just cut and pasted from Wikipedia, right? So they're just dictating what they read somewhere with no actual experience, and then trying to, say things like, well, age doesn't matter and experience doesn't matter, and this is scientifically notatedly reputable words, which is clear, they don't know what the word reputable means if they're using it to describe something that's not a person, right? Anyway, so of course on the flip side, you've got all these people, I've been doing this ding dang for 15 years and I ain't never did see nothing like that, right? And that crew, you're obviously not going to make too many changes on. But between the two, it's always my way and everything else is wrong, right? And so, as I mentioned before, I've been on all these platforms and I've been across different groups, and I've been in definitely computer science stuff, 3D printing stuff, laser sintering stuff briefly, all sorts of different places, right? The biology groups that I had to go and tap for help on trying to get this mini PCR thing to work, they didn't act like this. Even the video game discords, there's some fights and some arguments about how to play Reinhardt and Overwatch and stuff like that. But you're really not going to see somebody that they're not going to pull the shenanigans that the reptile hobby does. So speaking of shenanigans, let me tell you a couple great stories about the reptile hobby, right? And this isn't meant to, if you know who these people are, don't go harass these people. Don't, that's the point isn't to restart any of these arguments or anything like that. Hopefully it's to make you all laugh, because this is stuff that's gone under the bridge, whatever you want to call it, right? But I just want to share it with you. Particularly for the comedy, but also just to reflect on, everybody out there that asks, is the reptile community toxic? So the first thing we're going to start with is, so this was for ball python breeders, right, which are a particularly interesting bunch. There's a lot of different splintering inside of the ball python group. No matter how much people want to try to say that they're a tight-knit community of ball python breeders, it doesn't quite work like that. There are breeders that, have extremely high-end snakes and are doing their own thing, and then there's kind of people that are in the middle, and then, there's people that are just bootstrapping, or however you want to say it, right? And so I'm not picking on any particular group. It's just interesting to see the approach from all of those different levels. And then of course you have the pet keepers as well, but that doesn't generally fall under ball python breeder, right? They're generally just pet keepers. But anyway, so I joined this Discord, right? And it's full of, let's say, quite older individuals, right? And so I disagreed with something. And I wasn't saying you have to do it my way, right? I was saying this was my experience, and so I hope you have better luck, right? And so they took particularly offense to that, right? And so it was just one of those things. Nobody was like, I'm gonna kick your ass or nothing like that. It was just one of those things that's like, we're not gonna come to an agreement, so we'll just stop. The point wasn't to offend anybody or anything like that. Now, that person apparently just waited until they had another opportunity to start a whole brand new argument. And so what they did was, I had posted 2 ball pythons that I was really proud to have picked up because they had specifically some genes on them that I was really interested in working with. And in this case, it was black axanthic, right? And a handful of other genes. I'll show those snakes off some other time. Anyway, so I had bought these 2 snakes. They weren't cheap snakes, and I had posted them to the Discord. Now, in the pictures of the images that I had saved of those snakes, the breeder has a little ID number in the corner. So you can very easily tell whether or not that is the same picture as another one, because the ID number wouldn't match, of course, right? So what does this person do? This person says, those snakes are still on Morph Market, and implied that, of course, I didn't buy them because they wouldn't be on Morph Market if, still for sale, or they would be marked sold or whatever, right? So they're sitting there saying, I can find those snakes. I can find those snakes. You didn't buy those, right? Except I did buy, I absolutely bought those snakes, and I'll gladly send a PayPal receipt and everything else. And I believe I even did. I don't remember 100% for sure or not. But it went on for an hour where the person says, nope, those are not the snakes you bought. I have the link. All of my friends have looked at it, and we know that those snakes are still on Morph Market. Unfortunately, that was completely impossible. When I purchased those snakes, the listings were flat out deleted. And that's not something that's super rare. A lot of breeders will reuse this, let me try that, round two. A lot of breeders will reuse Morph Market listings, and a lot of the times, if they sell their snakes at an expo or something like that, they might just flat out delete the listing. So obviously, if you've sold it to somebody on Morph Market, you probably want to keep it on there, and so you get the little sold tag. But it's really not outside of the realm of possibility or even something that's bad or whatever. Just delete the listing because the snake is already sold. So when I said that, they of course turned around and said, what kind, that's your problem. You buy snakes from unreputable breeders that delete listings, which is just, it just got crazier and crazier, right? For the record, those snakes came from Justin Kabilko, which is, you know, Canova now, right? So that would be a little tiny breeder that clearly these people had never heard about. And by little tiny breeder, I mean, these people had no idea what the hell they were talking about, right? So that was their take, was that I hadn't bought those snakes, they could find those snakes, but still couldn't provide a link, and then wanted to say that, you know, other sellers were unprofessional for deleting listings and that I was lying about the entire thing, right? So that was about the point that I realized that there's no coming back from this. So I tagged one of the moderators and said, hey, I think I'm getting trolled. What's going on here? Can you go find out what link this person is talking about? I didn't realize the moderator and that person were really good friends. So what they did is proceed to tell me that I was not capable of accepting help and that they were trying to help me locate the snakes that I had bought, which is an insane story. And I don't believe either of those people are so stupid as to believe that that was true. That was their excuse, right? So of course, mutes and kicks and all this other stuff. But not only that, they then went to 3 or 4 other Discords and told everybody, do not let this person into your Discord because they are a hysterical woman. I find it particularly damning for the reptile community / hobbies / whatever that the best insult they could come up with was to call me a woman. Ugh, it just feels gross in the year 2022, right? That just kind of feels gross, right? So anyway, so not to pick on too much of the, the Morph Market side or whatever you want to call that, the unethical side or whatever, right? So now if we go over to the ethical side, there's plenty that I really hate the word ethical because I really don't see much behavior that would even constitute that, right? So you'll know if you've watched any of the videos before that I like to make fun of Liam Sinclair of Reptiles and Research because he comes up with some of the most harebrained stuff. And he's one of the people that isn't presenting with you so that you can learn together. He's dictating to you what he read. In a lot of the cases, he is just extraordinarily naive on a lot of this stuff. You'll know that I made a short where he was trying to tell people that thermometers work by shooting infrared lasers, which is completely untrue. So in response to that, he went and found me on Discord to proceed to say some kind of derogatory things about women, including implying people were his ex-girlfriend or something, who, I mean, I'm sorry she left you, Liam, but no reason to try to insult people in her name, right? That's rough, that's rough. Anyway, so yeah, he's still wrong about that. There's no rationalizing whether or not that's correct or not. It's flat out wrong. That's not how the thermometers work. And that, of course, isn't the first time I've had run-ins or however you want to say it with Liam. I did a talk on the Animals at Home Network podcast about nidovirus because I wanted to warn people that this is happening again, right? And when I say that, that's a bad way to say that because it's not happening again, it's always happening. You can go back and see different talks from, Dr. Stahl, and he will say that, this is going to be something that we should take responsibility for. That we're not taking responsibility for it, and that it is a serious problem. You can see people like Dr. Stenglein, I'm sorry, I always get his name wrong, who is an actual professor in this stuff, right? And it directly related to this field, just like Dr. Stahl. And they talk about nidovirus in a particularly, serious way, right? I don't know anybody that doesn't want to protect their pets, and I definitely think it's ethical to want to extend the life of your pets and make sure that you're not transmitting disease. However, when talking about that, Liam decided to take what I had said on Animals at Home Network podcast, and he turned around and implied that he was a better keeper because he knew how to quarantine one bearded dragon from none bearded dragons. That is quite literally idiot-proof, and I would humbly like to extend a congratulations to Liam for accomplishing that. It's really heartfelt, and I'm glad you were able to do that, buddy. In the process of that, he also said things like, I was guilty of libel and slander because I'm not sure he knows what those words mean. But that's typical for many of the ethical keepers as well. So you say something and then the goal is to bury it, ban it, delete it, whatever they can do so that they don't have to deal with it because they have a very narrow view of the world, right? There's, for another example, there's all the talk about UV, right? I will absolutely say that a lot of that talk is completely naive and a lot of that talk is actually harmful. To bring up good old reptiles and research again, and part of the Reptile Lighting Forum, you actually had people like, what's the man's name? Roman Murin, that's right. So you actually have somebody like Roman Murin saying that someday the World Health Organization will realize they were as wrong about vitamin D as they were about masks. This is wrong. There's a meta-study that came out not too long ago that encompassed all of the other studies that people had done as far as the vitamin D interaction with COVID-19. And just like every other study, it came up with that there is no compelling evidence that these things have any sort of prophylactic or anything like that. So that means they do not prevent you from transmitting the virus. So Roman Murin was completely wrong. Liam Sinclair's video telling you to stand in the sunlight before you get on the train to prevent catching infections, completely wrong. This is borderline COVID-19 disinformation. And of course, Liam's video was knocked off of Dr. John Campbell, who's found himself in a lot of hot water, up to and including being one of the people that supported trying to give people ivermectin to prevent COVID-19. Flat out COVID-19 disinformation, ethically, right? I guess, because that's what ethical keepers do, right? Kind of talking about the different communities, if you jump over to something like dogs or cats or rabbits or whatever, you're going to run into these pockets of people that talk about, raw diets and natural diets or even vegan diets, right? In a lot of these instances, some of this stuff doesn't seem beneficial to the animals whatsoever. But generally, you don't have people falling for, well, you need to put your dog under UV light so it can simulate the sun. You don't have people saying, well, you have a Chihuahua, so what you need to do is recreate the weather patterns of Mexico inside your home. That's not something that we usually see in those areas. And if it is, then the critical mass of people quickly, they just storm over those people and it ends, right? It's not a big deal. However, over in the reptile community, there are a lot of unknowns. There really are a lot of unknowns. We're trying to be successful with these animals and do things correctly. And for some reason, people really want to believe that UV light is the end-all, be-all cure for everything. But it's not. It's really not. The overwhelming evidence says that UV light is a harmful radiation. When you hear people like John Courtney Smith say that UV light is going to disinfect your cage, then he obviously knows that it disrupts cells. UV light that is not purposely emitted from standard fluorescent lamps, so not a reptile lamp, a fluorescent lamp that you would have in your workplace or school or whatever. One of the problems, let's say, with fluorescent lamps that people used to complain about was that it was possible for those fluorescent lamps to leak ultraviolet light, which is true. It's true. If you go and take your solar meter and go run it up to some of the different types of fluorescent lamps that are not reptile UV lamps, you might actually see some numbers tick up. And that's because of the way a fluorescent lamp works, which John Courtney Smith got completely wrong when he explained it on an Animals at Home Network podcast episode, which is mind-blowing because it's literally his job, so that's kind of weird. Halogen lights also were under fire for that. If you go and you look at halogen lights that you can buy at, whether it's a hardware store or a pet shop, it doesn't matter. Look at the halogen light, and there will be crystal clear ones, which are undoped, and there will be ones that have kind of a bluish reflective, maybe even look kind of burnt, or however you want to say it, and those are doped. So the reason they started doping the halogen lights is to prevent them from leaking as much ultraviolet light as they normally do. So that's right, ultraviolet light, or I'm sorry, that's right, halogen lights also produce ultraviolet light. Now, I'm not telling you that a normal fluorescent lamp or a halogen lamp are going to be enough UV radiation to keep your bearded dragon healthy. I'm not telling you that whatsoever. What I'm telling you is that what was found was that these lamps emit this type of harmful radiation. And not knowing about, tiny little things like the entire country of New Zealand, which is one of the skin cancer capitals of the world, it kind of should reduce the ethical keeper mentality that they should start hanging UV lamps in their own homes, because that's completely literally insane. That doesn't stack up with science whatsoever. So when you see channels named, research, you would assume that they would know this. Another fun word that the reptile hobby likes to use is husbandry, right? And it's especially pervasive in the ethical keeper camp. Husbandry. There are husbandry experts, right? When I was growing up, we had husbandry programs which pretty much taught you, how, go make sure that the cows are okay, right? Sometimes they touched on common diseases. Rarely did they ever have any sort of genetic stuff. But husbandry is a word, it's like a 14th century word for a man that milks the cows. That's the husbandman that lives on the farm. So it's still kind of weird to me that people adopt that term, because it's literally an agriculture term. I don't feel like that would be an ethical way to take care of these animals, is to lock yourself within that farming term. But hey, it's obviously ethical keepers that dictate exactly what ethics are. So I mean, that might be a little pedantic of a point, but it's kind of a weird one to me. So one of the last stories that I'm going to tell you is another one that is this I think is a great story that should definitely get some laughs. I hope it gets some laughs, right? So speaking of UV light, there was a time where I was on a Discord where somebody was having a conversation about UV lights. And an argument broke out whether or not you should get a fluorescent bulb that covers the entire length of the enclosure, or if you should get a fluorescent bulb that only partially covers part of the enclosure. And this is something that you can look up for yourself. Dr. Frances Baines, if you can avoid the weird, she mentioned like cytokines and stuff, which directly come from COVID-19 disinformation again, on an Animals at Home Network podcast. But just that one piece of information obviously doesn't discredit the overwhelming, absolutely great body of work that Dr. Frances Baines has managed to give us here in the reptile hobby. But if you look at some of the work that they have done, they talked about things like sunbeam methods. They talked about having gradients in the enclosure. I believe if you go to the Arcadia website right now, they even talk about having UV gradients in the enclosure itself. So obviously, if you have a fluorescent lamp that extends the entire length of the enclosure, that's not really a sunbeam or a gradient, right? So the newer way of thinking, because I remember when everybody had a bearded dragon, you put a fluorescent lamp all the way across the top, and that's what you did, right? But of course today, people are looking more at different ways to accomplish these UV levels that these animals should have. And the sunbeam method it does seem like a pretty promising one. If you have a very large enclosure, you obviously can't run fluorescent lamps 10 feet across or 20 feet across or something like that, right? You'd probably be better off at that point in time just opening up a sunroof or something, right? But anyway, the point being is that this argument broke out on Discord, right? And one of the people engaged in this argument was actually a moderator of what used to be the Snake Discovery Discord. Now, that Discord started by fans of Snake Discovery. That was not started by Emily or Ed or anything like that. That was fans of Snake Discovery started this thing. And if you had gone over there, then you would see some of the worst behavior that I have ever seen on a reptile Discord. There were people that were, telling people that they should be ashamed and they're the reason their animal died and that there's no reason they should have made a mistake and they were lazy, and then banning them from the server and all sorts of just vicious, ridiculous stuff. And these people were not, well-experienced keepers or anything like that. I'm pretty sure a few of them were under 20 or something like that. And probably with their first, Mexican black king snake, a la following the same path of somebody like Liam Sinclair. And they just had many opinions. And many of those opinions you could tell just came from echo chambers of Facebook and stuff like that, right? So they would sit there and literally bully people. Somebody would have a question about, what size enclosure should I get? And the enclosure sizes constantly kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now all of a sudden you need a 500-gallon enclosure for a bearded dragon and stuff like that. And they were literally gatekeeping people getting these animals by adding all this extra complexity and requirements and all of these things that these animals may or may not need, let's put it that way, right? Because there are many people that have been successful with bearded dragons, you know, and go find a nice PVC like one of these, 4x2x2, and you can keep a bearded dragon just fine. It doesn't have to be 500 gallons or whatever ridiculous stuff they came up with. Now, these people never ever talked about disease, which is something else that I find interesting, because the most ethical people never talk about disease. Unless it's MBD, right? I guess that's the one that you can see, so that's what makes them talk about that one the most. Anyway, so this snake discovery, and not really snake discovery, this fan, whatever you want to call it, moderator, Discord dude, whatever. This person started to, you know, talk in this very like, you know, LARPy, role-playing a college professor. The information that you have presented is not backed by scientific evidence, and therefore I believe that it is completely ridiculous. So I'm going to cut and paste all of the messages from this server to all the other servers so that they may laugh at your ignorance, right? And they got this really ridiculous take in their head that they were gonna, you know, they were absolutely right and everybody was gonna laugh at everybody else or something. It was really ridiculous, right? So that's when I stepped in and said, hey, here are links, right? The link that they even provided at one point in time actually showed the sunbeam method. So it was kind of weird that they didn't understand what the sunbeam method was. But this is something else that you obviously see on social media. Is people throw in these links, they don't actually read them. They just read the headline, think it agrees with what they said, and they plop it in there. That's exactly how we got, you know, some of the sun prevents viruses nonsense like Liam Sinclair produced, right? Is because you can definitely find stuff that will say, you know, there's a link between vitamin D and such virus or disease or whatever, right? You can certainly find stuff like that. But if you scroll down to the bottom to the conclusion, it will generally say, there does seem to be strong evidence, but there is not a conclusive amount of evidence to indicate that there is a definite link or something like that, right? It'll be a murky answer that says that this requires more study. Almost every single one will say it requires more study because nobody came up with a definitive conclusion that that was a thing before people started running with it. And that was, you know, news was running with it. And then of course, you know, the reptile hobby was clamping on to those keywords and, you know, throwing that up. But anyway, so back on point. So this wacky doodle Discord mod from the old snake discovery Discord, right, had this whole argument with somebody. And then not only that, but then they continued it over on YouTube on somebody else's video. So that was another point where I stepped in and said, you're not correct. You are just not correct. At that point in time, they went and wrote a letter to another Discord server owner that said that they were in physical fear of their safety. There were never any words exchanged about, oh, I'll kick your ass or anything like that. There were never any words exchanged like that. Nobody knows who anybody is because it's Discord, and that individual person changes their name and everything like pretty rapidly, right? So even if somebody was like hunting this person, there's no way we would ever know who they were or how to find them. And it was definitely a paradigm in behavior where they went from being this big badass researcher to now being in fear for their physical safety because people disagree with me. But that's the typical fragile little man syndrome, right, that we see. And I mean, this person didn't, I don't believe, identified as a man, but that's a typical fragile little man syndrome that we see, where people, you know, realize that they're wrong, and so they want to speak to the manager and they want to do all these other things, and they want to make a story out of something that wasn't one. So they piss off back to the Snake Discovery server, which eventually Snake Discovery cut ties to because it was complete and utter trash. I believe it's still around, and you'll have all of these people LARPing all of this experience and they're husbandry experts and all of this stuff. And those same people are the ones that do things like post in the middle of chat that they have to take their retic into the shower and literally waterboard them with the shower head as a dental examination, which is, if you've ever heard of having to take a retic into a bathtub and waterboard it to make sure its teeth don't fall out, you let me know. Now, my experience, my knowledge of retics is that they definitely do push. They can definitely miss something and get a mouthful of substrate or something like that. But I mean, a snake's head is kind of made out of rubber bands and chewing gum almost, right? So they can flex those jaws out and push that stuff out of their mouth. What do you think they would do in the wild, right? That's one of the things that ethical keepers always want to focus on is what would you do in the wild? So what would a snake do in the wild if it got a mouthful of dirt? Do you think it would really get a cavity and die? No, that's not what happens. They're able to push that material out. And whatever they can't push out, they obviously swallow and it's totally fine. Same as if you or I ate some sand. And I'm not saying obviously 10 pounds of sand. I'm saying if you got dirt in your mouth because you dropped your hot dog on the ground and picked it back up and you ate it, you'd be totally fine, right? You're not going to suddenly die of impaction or anything like that, right? And neither are these animals, you know? So it was just a really weird place to be. That when it was the Snake Discovery web server, or the Snake Discovery Discord server, it was a very, very strange place to be. I mean, people obviously in fear of their lives or whatever, and then other people waterboarding retics, which is bizarre. It's just bizarre, right? I mean, that's definitely not the end of all of the wonderful stories about the non-toxic people of the reptile hobby. But yeah, it was something that I kind of wanted to, you know, again, I don't want anybody to go attack anybody or anything like that. I just want to share with you stories of what happens in the reptile community. And a lot of the times, this kind of stuff is what forces people away. You know, there's a reason that we don't have a lot of engagement from researchers and veterinarians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because if I'm getting, you know, 15 people that are telling me that I'm going to end the ball python hobby as a whole or whatever, then I'm sure that people like Dr. Hannah Seidel are probably getting some extremely wacky doodle emails. I'm sure Rare Genetics probably has a mailbox full of just completely insane crap, you know, and that's what really reduces the engagement in our hobby. And people do it on purpose. You know, there's this thing called the Pareto Principle where, you know, 10% of the people cause 90% of the problems, or, you know, make 90% of the noise, or whatever you want to fill that with. And I think that's really what we have in the reptile hobby. When you start looking at social media and stuff, that's basically what the other communities and stuff have. But usually their 10% of people are, I dare say, slightly more educated, right? Let's look at dogs, for example. You know, so if somebody was to try to open an animal shelter, many states have laws specifically about animals that you can have at animal shelters. You definitely want to check into your local state, but some states you're not allowed to surrender an animal to anything except an actual animal shelter. And a lot of the times those animal shelters are identified as 501c organizations. That's a not-for-profit organization, right? So it would be flat out illegal to go surrender it to somebody that just put a sign in their front yard that said rescue, right? That's you wouldn't be able to do that, at least not legally, right? At least not ethically, right? And if you were the one surrendering the animal, that definitely wouldn't be ethical, right? You should go out and find an actual shelter for that animal if you do have an animal that you can't take care of. But here in the reptile hobby, we have a specific word for that, and it's been a thing for decades. So if you hunt around on Craigslist and then try to get animals at a reduced price to then sell them for more, that's called flipping. And rescues don't flip animals. It doesn't matter if you've got more operating costs. If you have more operating costs than you started with, one, you're probably you didn't do your 501c. You probably tried to run it as a for-profit business, and you're probably not able to sustain that. As a 501c, you would have been able to go out and get veterinarians to donate time. You would have been able to get other resources donated to you because you were a not-for-profit. You could have even probably engaged in charities, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that somebody puts a sign that says rescue after they collect a bunch of misfit animals off of Craigslist, and then they say that they're rescuing them, is another thing that's completely insane in the reptile hobby. And I hope that we put, you know, that stops happening. That's something that is completely unethical. However, you won't see any of the ethical keepers talking about this, because most of the ethical keepers are the ones that are doing this, right? They say that they rescue all of these animals without any sort of qualifications, without any sort of medical guidance, without anything. And just for the record too, you know, I do want to mention this, is that so I make videos that obviously talk about nidovirus and stuff like that. And nidovirus isn't the worst thing in the reptile hobby. You know, Cryptosporidium is probably the worst thing, right? That's hard to detect in a lot of different snakes. That's a devastating disease, cryptosporidiosis. And it's not something that is isolated to reptile. That's not just a reptile disease per se, right? So that's something you can catch at a public swimming pool. Now, of course, humans can pass this. You can also, you know, preschools and stuff like that generally have some sort of protocols or something in place to try to prevent the spread of cryptosporidiosis. So this stuff is, I don't care who you heard what from. If you go to the actual Center for Disease Control, the CDC, government agency here in the US, right? If you go to that agency, you will see that there is nothing that disinfects Cryptosporidium. that is an organism that is very tough. Now, of course, when I say nothing, and when they say nothing, that obviously excludes things like, well, if I put my entire 422 enclosure inside of my oven and cook it at 500 degrees, that'll kill it. Yeah, that will also melt the plastic. That doesn't make any sense. So calm down, don't go to the extreme, understand that we're talking about practically kill it, right? You'll also hear people say, well, UV light will kill it, right? And that's a whole other nonsensical ball of wax I'd definitely do a different video on, right? Yeah, we had good old Dr. Travis Wyman tried this. He tried to say that he was going to completely prevent nidovirus by using a mechanical system that flashed UVC lights or something like that, and refused to acknowledge that UVA and B also disrupt cells. There's I think it's more than 40 years old technology called SODIS, which is the solar disinfection of water. And this is used in areas where they don't have access to filters or clean water, right? And it basically uses only the light of the sun. So there's no UVC there because we don't have UVC that comes through the atmosphere. So UVA and B light absolutely do disrupt organisms. So when you hear John Courtney Smith say that, oh, it disinfects your enclosure, he is not right. He's not wrong, but he's not right. So as far as completely disinfecting an enclosure, no, you should still clean normally. You know, even if it's bioactive and all these other things, you should still do your best effort to clean, right? Especially if you transfer animals between cages, you should absolutely do your best effort to clean and disinfect and all that other stuff. But when it comes to just flashing something with UV light, that's not something that is probably the last approach that people take. And to hear somebody like Dr. Travis Wyman try to say that there's some, harebrained system that he's gonna tabletop right on the back of a napkin as a researcher in genomics, not a doctor, not an whatever, ECE engineer, whatever you wanna call it, right? Nothing like that. But to hear this harebrained back of a napkin nonsense about UVC mechanisms to absolutely stop nidovirus, it's completely insane. If you look at hospitals, then you'll see that usually what they use is vaporized peroxide, and that's the cheapest and most effective method and most widespread method. And you can look this up on your own. Don't take my word for it. Go look up and find out what your hospital uses. If they're having, UVC light that roams around, no, they don't do that, right? That's ridiculous. Now, of course, there are systems that, go into, air filters or water filters that are UVC based or UV based, right? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in areas that living animals are in, including humans, right? So I wouldn't put UVC shining down on me to disinfect this area because that would cause me a lot of harm, right? So I would be better off going with something like the vaporized peroxide if I had the ability to do that, negative pressure room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is another area where Dr. Travis Wyman can't be this stupid. He can't be this stupid. So this was obvious trolling, but I'm the toxic person, right? So anyway, it's funny. But yeah, there's no way, I do not believe that he as a researcher could be this naive and not know of these things, because it's simple enough. Just pick up a book or just, Google it if you want, it's easy stuff, especially Google SODIS. So that alone, I'm sure ethical keepers will be super happy to learn about that, because that is UVA and UVB, the same thing emitted by a lamp in a reptile enclosure that's actually disinfecting water. And then I'm sure the unethical, or whatever we're calling the other side, because we have to make this false dichotomy, because I'm the unethical, or I'm the toxic person, right? But we have to make this false dichotomy where we separate the community, right, into these weird niches, right? But yeah, everybody should go learn about that. It's pretty interesting. I think that might actually be the end of the, oh, actually, here's another fun one, right? So something else that you'll remember, I made a video, because I just mentioned Dr. Travis Wyman, so this reminded me of it. So Dr. Travis Wyman proceeded to kind of talk a little bit of smack about people in the industry not getting terms right, and then proceeded to get a term completely wrong, right? So it was kind of funny. So I made a video about it, immediately got hit with a false copyright strike from Justin Smith of Herpetoculture magazine. This is another one of those areas where, have you ever been on YouTube? If you have ever been on YouTube, then you know that a lot of the most popular YouTubers do reaction videos and things like that. You'll know about fair use. YouTube actually has a class on it when you become a creator. They obviously want you to know what fair use and copyright is. So this was, again, I don't believe that Justin Smith is so incredibly stupid as to believe that, that copyright strike was actually accurate. So he tried to censor his own friend being incorrect, right? So that was pretty funny. Of course, that video is still up. I'll probably re-upload it just for fun because it fell out of shorts for whatever odd reason. And then, of course, Puget Sound Pythons, Puget Sound, whatever it is, they show up to tell me that I'm the worst part of the reptile hobby. False copyright strikes and censorship, okay. Ethical keepers making stuff up, okay. Dr. Travis Wyman trying to convince people to make harebrained UVC mechanical systems, okay. But I'm the toxic person. It's funny, it's just funny the way that people use that word. I mean, I can definitely be toxic, absolutely. I will argue with pretty much anybody. And I will do it very quickly at 100 words per minute as a comp sci major. Like it's my job, because sometimes it is. But yeah, overall, is the reptile community toxic? Absolutely, absolutely it is. And the only way that we solve that is that we actually, work with each other to learn together. And there are a lot of people doing this. There are a lot of people that are already doing this. I would just say that the majority that you see online are not doing this. The majority that you see online are people that have to kind of validate themselves or something that, well, like good old little Liam Sinclair, right? He's going to go to war with Nerd, went to war with him on the forums, and then made a whole video with a doctor that ethically euthanized more retics than, probably more retics than he helped. I don't know for sure, right? And the reason that he euthanized that person's collection is because retics just get too long. Ethical, right? Ethical, right? So that was an ethical keeper's approach to threatening Nerd legally from across the ocean, which was completely nonsensical, right? There's a whole video series about that, all that other, and I'm obviously not defending Nerd. I have my own problems with Nerd, right? But ultimately though, it just makes you question what ethical actually means. On a closing note, actually, this one's even better. So one of the things across the board that people tend to kind of talk badly about is PetSmart, right? And I'm not defending PetSmart. Don't get confused and think I'm defending PetSmart. But across the board, people do not like PetSmart, right? They say that, people go in there, they buy animals, they don't have the proper education about them, and they're not going to be successful with them. And that's interesting. And one of the reasons that it's interesting is that Arcadia, run by John Courtney Smith specifically does Arcadia Reptile, which used to be Bird and Reptile, right? So John Courtney Smith, I'm sure, considers himself an ethical keeper, talks a lot of game about, raising these animals naturally and all this stuff, right? And Arcadia fills the shelves of PetSmart, right? So if you've ever been in a PetSmart, go to the aquarium section. You'll see nothing but Arcadia aquarium stuff, right? And you'll say, oh, well, that's Arcadia Aquarium. Maybe that doesn't have anything to do with Arcadia Reptile. So I want you to go over to the reptile side and go look at some of the light bulbs over there, because what you'll find out is that Arcadia is now filling the Thrive brand boxes at PetSmart. Now, some people, of course, will try to rationalize this as, well, Arcadia is getting the right equipment into people's hands, but those people still don't have the proper education for these animals. So it comes to a point where it doesn't really matter. And if you've ever been inside of a Best Buy or a PetSmart, it's a retail store. Their job is to try to get you to impulse buy stuff and upsell you on things that you may not even need, right? This is the nature of retail. So if you have to go into a PetSmart to buy your equipment for your animal, then that means that you are subject to impulse buys and everything else, right? Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into a PetSmart and impulse buy the end cap of reptiles or anything like that. That's not going to happen. But you would think the average person, that's right, that's what people say, the average person is going to go in there to pick up a piece of equipment and then decide that they're going to rescue the bearded dragons that are cohabbed at the PetSmart, right? And so this is a circle. This is a weird, vicious cycle and completely fueled by Arcadia. Right? So they get you in there to buy the Arcadia products where it's more likely that you would impulse buy one of these animals and then ethically probably not be able to keep it, either because it's wild caught, full of parasites, already has crypto, or whatever happened. These animals weren't healthy to begin with, or if you just make mistakes and those animals don't survive. But these people still say I'm rescuing it, right? With their Arcadia lamp in their hand. And of course, Arcadia lamps full of mercury. So And when I say full of mercury, it is a trace amount of mercury, but I have yet to meet anybody across the ethical keeper spectrum, across the whatever we're calling the other side, that actually takes their UV lamps to hazardous waste. I haven't met too many people that do that. And so that's another funny part of ethical, where you have people that are buying up these lamps and then throwing them in landfills where trace amounts of mercury end up in the groundwater that is destroying habitats of things like hognose snakes that I have here, not too far from where I live, right? So that habitat is totally destroyed, and one of the reasons is definitely going to be groundwater contamination, right? So we're directly contributing to groundwater contamination by not telling people to go throw this stuff out in hazardous waste. Ethical, right? So I do not appreciate that ethical word. Anyway, hopefully I've talked enough to share some stories that, again, the goal here isn't to harass anybody or call anybody out or anything like that. It's just, I really want people to look at some of this stuff. And the next time that you have an interaction with somebody in the reptile community or the reptile hobby or whatever it is, just take a moment and take a step back and consider, are they trying to learn with me? Are they coming at me with some pop-sci naive nonsense they saw on a news report somewhere? Are they inflating their YouTube numbers by trying to make videos about preventing respiratory infections in the middle of a pandemic, right? Like, what exactly are they doing? Is it actually ethical, or is that just a new badge because they want you to buy animals from their friends and not from people that aren't their friends, right? So is it a nepotism thing? Is it one of those things where they are, bolstering up the person and not the idea? The idea suffers because the person can never be wrong, right? Like that kind of stuff is what really makes a toxic environment. And again, I'm glad to say I can certainly be toxic at times, but when it comes to communities like the reptile hobby, that is relatively small, especially compared to other animal hobbies, this kind of stuff adds up. So, just once again, send that point home. Is the reptile community toxic? Absolutely. But not any more toxic than other areas. However, I have never once been on a game server where somebody has gone to the owner and said that they were in physical fear of their safety. That's never happened. I don't think I've ever been on like a dog or 3D printer or any sort of coding related server where anything like that happened either. And again, quite the paradigm for somebody to be such a big badass on the internet and then turn around and say that they're in fear of their physical safety. That's interesting. It's an interesting one. But that's the end of this video. I promise I will make the video on how to do the experiment for lavender albino. As mentioned, I just get a little burned out on the reptile hobby. I really do. I've got my own work to do. You can see these great cages behind me that I need to work on. And so really, if I could sit here and make a video that I know I'm only going to get negative messages about and people telling me that, Justin Kabilka is the Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos and all this other insane stuff about disease and how viruses are stopped by the sun. I don't have the capacity to deal with that all the time. So here's hoping that this video doesn't attract Justin Smith or Puget Sound to come tell me that I'm what's wrong with the reptile hobby, or get me banned from the Morph Market community forums for a third time because I don't believe that, a harebrained UVC mechanical system is a thing. But see you later.